back with us. And his lesson title today is Never Give Up. So, welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you. Nice to be here. This morning, I want to talk about failure, but perhaps it would be more accurate to say I want to talk about how to eliminate failure from your life. Would you like to do that? No more failure? Well, listen up, because there'll be a test at the end and you wouldn't want to fail. About 30 years ago, I decided to explore the possibility of becoming a life coach. It sounded like something that I'd like to know more about, so I signed up to take a series of weekend intensives with the Coaches Institute in order to become certified as a life coach. I never did get fully certified, but I did learn a lot. I came out of the first weekend session really loving the whole process and the people involved. However, the second weekend session, I got myself in trouble. They started off this session asking us to reflect on a major failure that we had experienced and then to share it with the group so that the coach facilitators would coach us about how to turn lemons into lemonade. When it was my turn, I explained that I didn't have any failures to talk about. And of course, no one believed me, but it was true. I told them that in my teens, I had decided that success and failure were simply decisions or judgments that we make about what to call the outcome of an event. An event happens to us, and we choose whether to see it as a success or a failure. When I took a close look at the world around me, I came to the conclusion that success or failure are not built into an event. I could take pretty much anything that could happen to a person, whether it was something like being diagnosed with cancer or it was winning lottery. And I could see examples of some people who experienced that event and were devastated by it, and others who experienced the same event and used it as a jumping off point for greatness. The secret to eliminating failure from your life is to realize it doesn't actually exist unless you put it there. Others may make a judgment that you've experienced a failure, but until you decide to call it a failure, it's simply an unintended outcome. Of course, I was now faced with the paradox of the fact that I had failed at being a failure, except that I didn't consider it a failure, and so around and around we went. So much for my coaching accreditation. The events that happen to all of us are just events without any power at all. However, we give tremendous power to the events that occur in our lives by assigning labels to them that are filled with emotional meaning. The different outcomes experienced by people who had the same event was not the event itself, but how they perceived it, what they labeled it. If I see something as a disaster, I'm going to react in disaster mode. And all of my mental, emotional, and physical reactions will be geared to dealing with disaster. I will create the disaster mentally in myself and become protective and defensive, dwelling on the horrible effects that this is going to create for me. And because of that, the horrible effects will most likely occur. If, on the other hand, I see that there is an opportunity in the event, my mind, emotions, and body will be programmed entirely differently, and my experience will be a positive one. Having figured that out early in life, I decided there would be no more failures in my life because I would not call any outcome a failure. Rather, I would always strive to see the opportunity in any situation. And there is always some kind of opportunity. Now, that may sound a little silly or Pollyanna-ish, but it's worked wonders for me. I don't want to give the impression that I went off on some sort of vision quest and came down from the mountain with this great new discovery. I didn't discover this idea. I just rediscovered it for myself. I've always been an avid reader and Growing up, I read a lot of books and listened to tapes by people, and I've since learned are new thought writers. I was simply absorbing what they wrote and making it my own. What the coach trainers were trying to teach us is that for the most people, events in their lives trigger a series of steps. First, an event happens to us. Step two is we evaluate what happened, filtering it through our own past experience and what we think we're supposed to perceive. From the evaluation, we assign a label to the event. We see the positive side of the event, and we program ourselves mentally, emotionally, and physically to have a positive outcome. Or if we see the event as negative, then we call it a failure and program ourselves mentally, emotionally, and physically to have a negative outcome. If we experience enough events that we call failures, then we may begin to see ourselves as a failure. When that happens, we turn to coaches and therapists to help us undo the negative effects. They'll work with us to show us the failures weren't really failures, they were simply learning experiences. The trick I had rediscovered was that by not choosing to label anything that happened to me in a negative way, I was simply skipping the failure stage and putting the coaches and therapists out of work. So, how does that fit with unity? Well, actually, it fits perfectly. It's the third principle in action. The third principle says we are the co creators with God, creating reality through thoughts held in mind. How powerful is that? We create our own reality. The events do not create our reality, they simply define the playing field. But we determine how we will play. So the question to ask yourself is what kind of reality am I creating for myself? Everything that's happening to me, to my family, to my church, to the world around me has an upside and a downside. We usually see both sides if we look hard enough. Which side am I focusing on? What message am I sending to my mental, emotional, and physical self? Am I creating my reality based on the upside or the downside? When we look at the lives of famous people, it's surprising how often we find some big event or events in their history that would be described by many people as failures. For instance, did you know that Henry Ford went broke 5 times before he founded the Ford Motor Company? R.H. Macy started and failed in 7 different businesses before hitting it big with his New York department store. Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken had his recipe rejected over 1,000 times before a restaurant accepted it. Walt Disney was fired from a newspaper because he, quote, lacked imagination and had no good ideas. He started a number of businesses that ended in bankruptcy and failure before his big success. Winston Churchill failed the 6th grade and was defeated in every election for public office until he became Prime Minister of England. Oprah Winfrey had a rough and abusive childhood and faced a number of career setbacks, including being fired as a television reporter because she was unfit for TV. Dr. Seuss had his first book rejected by 27 different publishers. Michael Jordan was cut from the high school basketball team. Here's a quote from Michael Jordan that I love. He said, quote, "I have missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. On 26 occasions, I've been entrusted to take the game-winning shot, and I missed. I have failed over and over and over again in my life. And that's why I succeed." End of quote. Do you think these people focused on the downside or the upside? Of course, they focused on the upside. One influence in my early life was a record by a man named Eddie Lawrence. It came out in 1956 and made it to the top of the Billboard charts. I realized that was before your time, but perhaps you heard it. Actually, he made a series of them, and they were all titled The Old Philosopher, Volume 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. I was about 15 years old at the time, and they resonated with me. It wasn't a song, but rather it was spoken. Here's the first verse of the first one. It went like this. Hiya, folks. You say you lost your job today? You say it's 4 a.m. and your kids ain't home from school yet? You say your wife went out for a corned beef sandwich last weekend. The corned beef came back and she didn't. You say your furniture is out all over the sidewalk because you can't pay the rent and you got chapped lips and paper cuts and your feet's all swollen up and blistered from pounding the pavement looking for work. Is that what's troubling you, fella? Well, lift your head up high and take a walk in the sun with a dignity and stick to itness. And you show the world where to get off. You never give up, never give up, never give up that ship. End of quote. We have a lot of stuff that happens to us, and maybe it's not as dramatic as the old philosophers' problems, but we can all count on the fact that stuff happens. You can't control that, but you can control how you experience the outcome. I should mention something here that my wife Bonnie called spiritual abuse, that sometimes results from people misinterpreting the third principle. This happens when something occurs and the abuser blames the event on the person it happened to. Let's say someone has an automobile accident, is upset about it, and the abuser says, well, we create our own reality with our thoughts, so you created that accident with your negative thinking. Wrong. We do not have real control over the stuff that happens to us, especially when it involves other people. What we do have control over is our reaction to this stuff. And as a consequence of that, we can control how we experience the event. Of course, it's easy to talk about focusing on the positive. The hard part is developing the habit of actually doing it and doing it every time. I've been practicing for many years, but I still find my initial reaction to situations can be a negative one. The one thing I can promise you is that every time it gets easier to turn that negative into a positive. There's a story that's been around for a while that points to the way to do this. I'm not sure where it originally came from, but the story goes like this. Quote, while waiting to pick up a friend at the airport in Portland, Oregon, I had one of those life-changing experiences that you hear people talk about, the kind that sneaks up on you unexpectedly. This one occurred a mere 2 feet away from me. Straining to locate my friend among the passengers deplaning through the jetway, I noticed a man coming toward me carrying 2 light bags. He stopped right next to me to greet his family. First, he motioned to his youngest, maybe 6 years old, as he laid down his bags. They gave each other a long, loving hug, and as they separated enough to look at each other's face, I heard the father say, "It's so good to see you, son. I missed you so much." His son smiled somewhat shyly and averted his eyes and replied softly, "Me too, Dad." Then the man stood up and gazed in the eyes of his eldest son, maybe 9 or 10. While cupping his son's face in his hands, he said, "You're already quite the young man. I love you so much, Zach." And they hugged each other in a most loving and tender way. While this was happening, a baby girl, perhaps 1.5, was squirming excitedly in her mother's arms, never once taking her little eyes off the wonderful sight of her returning father. The man said, "Hi, baby girl," as he gently took the child from her mother. He quickly kissed her face all over and then held her close to his chest while rocking her from side to side. The little girl instantly relaxed and simply laid her head on his shoulder, motionless in pure contentment. After several minutes, he handed his daughter to the eldest son and declared, "I saved the best for last," and proceeded to give his wife the longest, most passionate kiss I ever remember seeing. He gazed into her eyes for several seconds and then silently mouthed, "I love you so much." They stared at each other's eyes, beaming big smiles at one another while holding hands. For an instant, they reminded me of newlyweds. But I knew by the age of their kids that couldn't possibly be. I puzzled about it for a moment and then realized how totally engrossed I was in the wonderful display of unconditional love not more than an arm's length away from me. I suddenly felt very uncomfortable, as if I was invading something sacred, but I was amazed to hear my own voice nervously ask, "Wow, how long have you two been married?" "Been together 14 years total, married 12 of those," the man replied, without breaking his gaze from his lovely wife's face. "Well, then, how long have you been away?" I asked. The man finally turned and looked at me, still beaming his joyous smile, and said, 2 whole days. 2 days. I was stunned by the intensity of the greeting. I assumed he'd been gone at least for several weeks, if not months. And I know my expression betrayed me. I said, almost offhandedly, hoping to end my intrusion with some semblance of grace and get back to searching for my friend, "Boy, I hope my marriage is still that passionate after 12 years. The man stopped smiling. He looked me straight in the eye with a forcefulness that burned right into my soul, and he told me something that left me a different person. He told me, "Don't hope, friend, decide." Then he flashed me his wonderful smile again, shook my hand, and said, "God bless." For many of us, 2020 has been a rough year. And I suspect that many of us are tempted to think that we have experienced failures along the way. And so my message to you is this. This is a good time to take a little pause and to re-examine the so-called failures and find the positive part of the experience. Then leave the negative behind you and carry the good feelings with you into 2021. If you want to eliminate failure from your life, and I believe you can eliminate failure from your life, the first step is to decide, and then keep deciding each time life hands you something new to deal with. It's really that simple. Thank you, and namaste.
Thank you, Chris. That was really